The rusted door groaned like a wounded animal as Daniel Reed forced it open, revealing shadows that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Inside the abandoned school bus hidden deep in the forest lay evidence of lives once lived, a child's drawings still clinging to mildewed walls, height marks etched into rotting wood, and secrets that would haunt his family forever. What they discovered that autumn day would transform a simple family walk into an encounter with ghosts of the past. Stay with me as I share this incredible true story, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a shroud as Daniel Reed checked his hiking boots one final time, pulling the laces tight with practiced efficiency. Through the kitchen window of their modest suburban home, he watched his 10-year-old son Matthew bounce impatiently on the balls of his feet, already dressed and ready, his small backpack stuffed with what Daniel knew would be an absurd collection of essential items: a magnifying glass, 3 different types of string, a compass that barely worked, and probably half a dozen granola bars that Clara had snuck in when the boy wasn't looking. "You sure about this trail?" Clara asked, emerging from the hallway while braiding her auburn hair into a practical ponytail. She wore that expression Daniel had come to recognize over their 12 years of marriage, the one that said she'd go along with his plans, but wanted her reservations noted for the record. "The weather report mentioned possible storms this afternoon." Daniel pulled her close, kissing her forehead gently. "Since when has a little rain ever stopped the Reed family adventurers?" He felt her relax against him, that familiar surrender to his optimism that had carried them through harder times than a potentially wet hike. "Besides, we'll be back long before any weather hits. 3 hours tops." "Famous last words," Clara murmured, but she was smiling now, that radiant expression that still made his heart skip after all these years. Matthew burst through the back door with the explosive energy only a 10-year-old could muster before 9 in the morning. "Dad. Mom. Come on, we're burning daylight." The phrase, borrowed from his grandfather, sounded comically serious coming from such a young voice. "Burning daylight at 8:30 in the morning," Clara laughed, ruffling his sandy hair. "Where do you get this energy?" "From not drinking coffee and staring at phones all morning like you guys," Matthew shot back with a grin that was pure mischief. Daniel grabbed the hiking pack he'd prepared the night before, first aid kit, water bottles, emergency supplies, the works. He'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between adventure and misadventure, especially with a curious child in tow. "All right, troops, let's move out. Today's mission: explore the new trail system they opened up past Miller's Bend." They piled into the family SUV, Matthew claiming the middle seat in the back so he could lean forward between his parents, maintaining a steady stream of chatter about everything from his latest science project, volcanoes, because of course it was volcanoes, to theories about what kinds of animals they might encounter in the woods. Daniel caught Clara's eye in the rearview mirror, sharing a silent moment of parental amusement at their son's enthusiasm. The drive took them 45 minutes outside the city, past the suburban sprawl, and into the countryside where farms gave way to forest, where cell phone signals grew weak and the radio stations turned to static between the hills. Daniel had discovered this particular trail system through a coworker who claimed it offered some of the best hiking in the state, pristine, untouched, and blissfully uncrowded. They parked at a small gravel lot that held only 2 other vehicles, both looking like they'd been there since dawn, probably belonging to serious hikers who'd started at first light. The trailhead was marked by a wooden sign that had already begun to weather its carved letters, reading "Whisper Woods Trail System," along with a basic map showing 3 interconnected loops of varying difficulty. "Which one are we doing?" Matthew asked, already studying the map with the intensity of a military strategist. "I was thinking we'd start with the intermediate loop," Daniel replied, tracing the route with his finger. "It's about 4 miles, takes us past something called Cathedral Rocks, and then loops back through the old growth section." "Intermediate?" Matthew's voice dripped with preteen disdain. "Come on, Dad, we can handle advanced." "One step at a time, buddy. Let's see how intermediate goes first." Clara was already applying sunscreen to Matthew's neck despite his squirming protests. "You'll thank me when you're 40 and don't look like a leather handbag," she said, using the same line her own mother had used on her decades ago. They set off into the woods, following a well-marked trail that wound between towering oaks and maples, their leaves just beginning to turn with the first whispers of autumn. The morning sun slanted through the canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the forest floor. Daniel led the way with Matthew close behind and Clara bringing up the rear, their usual formation that allowed both parents to keep an eye on their adventurous son. The first mile passed in comfortable rhythm, their footfalls creating a steady percussion against the packed earth. Matthew pointed out every interesting rock formation, unusual tree, and potential animal hiding spot, his excitement infectious. Daniel found himself remembering his own childhood hikes with his father, those precious Saturday mornings when the world had seemed infinite with possibility. "Dad, look!" Matthew's voice broke through his reverie. The boy had stopped at a small stream that crossed the trail where someone had built an elaborate cairn, stones balanced impossibly on top of each other in defiance of gravity. "That's impressive," Daniel acknowledged, pulling out his phone to take a picture. "But remember, we look and appreciate, we don't touch. Someone put a lot of effort into that." I know," Matthew said, but he was already distracted by something else. A bright blue jay that had landed on a branch directly above them, cocking its head with what seemed like avian curiosity. They crossed the stream on stepping stones that had been placed there by the trail maintainers, Clara, accepting Daniel's offered hand even though she didn't really need it. These small gestures of care Daniel had learned were the mortar that held a marriage together, not the grand romantic gestures, but the 1,000 tiny kindnesses. The trail began to climb more steeply after the stream switched backing up the side of a ridge. Matthew's chatter decreased proportionally with the increase in elevation, his breath coming harder now. But he didn't complain, didn't ask to stop. The boy had inherited his father's stubborn pride and his mother's quiet determination. They reached Cathedral Rocks after an hour and a half of hiking, a formation of granite that jutted up from the forest floor like the spires of some ancient church. The rocks were covered in patches of lichen that glowed green gold in the filtered sunlight, and from their base you could see through the trees to the valley below. "Snack break," Clara suggested, already knowing the answer. Matthew flopped dramatically onto a flat rock, acting as if he'd just climbed Everest. They sat together on the rocks, sharing trail mix and water, listening to the forest sounds around them, the rustle of leaves, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the whisper of wind through the canopy. These were the moments Daniel treasured when the noise of modern life fell away and his family existed in a bubble of simple togetherness. "You know what I love about places like this?" Clara said, leaning against Daniel's shoulder. "They make you realize how small your problems really are. These trees have been here for decades, maybe centuries. They've weathered storms we can't even imagine." "Very philosophical, Mom," Matthew said through a mouthful of granola bar. "But I bet they never had to deal with Mrs. Henderson's math homework." "Fair point," Daniel laughed. "Though I think calculus might actually be easier than photosynthesis when you really think about it." They resumed hiking after their break, following the trail as it curved away from Cathedral Rocks and deeper into the forest. This section was older, the trees more massive, their trunks so wide that all three of them holding hands couldn't wrap around them. The underbrush was thicker here too, ferns growing in vast carpets and moss coating everything in velvet green. It was Matthew who noticed they'd somehow gotten off the main trail. One moment they were following the clear path with its occasional orange blazes on the trees, and the next they were pushing through undergrowth that grabbed at their clothes and scratched at their legs. "Dad, I don't see any more trail markers," Matthew said, a note of concern creeping into his voice. Daniel stopped looking around with a frown. He'd been so caught up in Clara's story about her week at work, something about a difficult client and a looming deadline, that he hadn't been paying attention to their surroundings. "We must have missed a turn. No big deal, we'll just backtrack." But when they turned around, the way back wasn't as clear as it should have been. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming moments before, suddenly felt maze-like and oppressive. Every direction looked the same, tree trunks stretching endlessly, undergrowth thick and tangled. "Daniel," Clara's voice carried a question and a warning. "It's fine," he assured her, pulling out his phone to check their GPS location. The screen showed no signal, the map application refusing to load. "Okay, so GPS is out, but we know we came from that direction." He pointed with confidence he didn't entirely feel. "So we just head back that way until we find the trail." They walked for what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably closer to 10, pushing through increasingly thick vegetation. Daniel's confidence began to waver, though he kept his expression neutral for Matthew's sake. The boy had gone quiet, sticking close to his mother's side. "Maybe we should stop and really think about this," Clara suggested, her teacher's problem-solving mind kicking in. "We know Cathedral Rocks is behind us somewhere, and the parking lot is roughly northwest of that." Daniel pulled out the actual compass from his pack, old school, but reliable. They oriented themselves and began walking in what should have been the right direction. The forest seemed to press closer with each step, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, roots rising from the earth to trip the unwary. It was then that Matthew saw it. "Dad, Mom, look!" His voice cracked with excitement and something else, awe maybe, or fear. He was pointing through a gap in the trees to their right. At first, Daniel couldn't make out what had caught his son's attention. The forest was thick there, shadows deep despite the midday sun. But then he saw at a flash of yellow through the green something distinctly unnatural in this natural setting. "Is that a building?" Clara asked, squinting. They pushed toward it, curiosity overcoming caution. The undergrowth was thicker here, as if nature had tried to build a wall around whatever lay beyond. Daniel went first, holding branches back for Clara and Matthew, his hiking boots crunching through years of accumulated leaves and debris. As they got closer, the shape became clearer, and Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't a building, it was a school bus. The vehicle sat in what must have once been a clearing, but was now being reclaimed by the forest. Vines wrapped around its wheels and climbed its sides like living cables. Small trees grew through the gaps where windows had once been. The yellow paint, once bright and cheerful, had faded to the color of old bones streaked with rust that looked like dried blood in the filtered light. "Holy crow," Matthew whispered, the expression borrowed from his grandmother, used when something exceeded his 10-year-old vocabulary's ability to describe. The bus was an old model, probably from the 70s or 80s based on its shape. It sat at an odd angle, its front end slightly raised, as if it had tried to climb over something and gotten stuck. The door was closed, the accordion-style folding mechanism frozen in rust and time. "How did a school bus get all the way out here?" Clara asked, voicing what they were all thinking. They were miles from any road suitable for a vehicle this size deep in forest that had been protected land for decades. "Maybe it's from before the forest was protected," Daniel suggested, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't quite make sense. The bus looked old, yes, but not that old. Matthew had already moved closer, his fear overtaken by the irresistible curiosity that seemed hardwired into children. He pressed his face against one of the few windows that remained intact, cupping his hands around his eyes to see through the grime. "There's stuff inside," he exclaimed. "Like a lot of stuff." Daniel joined him at the window, peering into the gloom within. At first he couldn't make out much, just shadows and shapes. But as his eyes adjusted, details began to emerge. The seats had been removed or rearranged. There were what looked like shelves along one wall, and was that a mattress in the back? "Someone lived here," he said quietly. Clara had found a stick and was using it to clear away some of the vines from the side of the bus, revealing more details. Under the grime and growth, they could make out the remnants of "School d'Estier" in black letters, the rest lost to rust and time. "Should we go inside?" Matthew asked, his voice a mixture of eagerness and apprehension. Daniel's first instinct was to say no, to turn around and leave this strange discovery undisturbed. But looking at his son's face, seeing that spark of adventure and wonder, he hesitated. When would they ever have another chance like this? And really, what harm could there be in looking? The bus had clearly been abandoned for years, probably decades. "Let me check it out first," he said, moving toward the door. "You two stay back until I make sure it's safe." The door resisted at first, the mechanism frozen with rust and debris. Daniel put his shoulder into it, and with a groan that seemed to echo through the forest, it gave way. The accordion doors folded back with a screech that sent birds fleeing from the nearby trees. The smell hit him first, musty, earthy, with undertones of mildew, and something else, something indefinably sad. Abandoned places had a particular scent Daniel had always thought, as if loneliness itself had an odor. He climbed the steps, carefully testing each one before putting his full weight on it. The rubber treads had long since rotted away, leaving bare metal that had somehow avoided complete rust through. Inside the bus was both exactly what he'd expected and completely surprising. The front half had been converted into a living space. Where rows of seats should have been, someone had built what looked like a rudimentary kitchen. A camp stove sat on a wooden counter jerry-rigged to vent through a hole cut in the roof. Shelves lined one wall, still holding mason jars filled with unidentifiable contents, their lids rusty but intact. A sink had been installed, connected to what looked like a water tank mounted where some seats had been removed. "Is it safe?" Clara called from outside. "Yeah, it's actually kind of amazing," Daniel called back. "Come look at this." Matthew practically flew up the steps, his earlier hesitation forgotten. Clara followed more cautiously, one hand on the doorframe as if ready to flee at the first sign of danger. "Someone really lived here," Matthew said, his voice hushed with awe. He was examining everything with the intensity of an archaeologist discovering a tomb. "Look, there's even curtains." He pointed to the remnants of fabric hanging in the windows, so degraded they were barely more than threads. The middle section of the bus had been turned into what looked like a sitting area. A couch had been fashioned from what might have been old bus seats, reupholstered with fabric that had once been colorful but was now faded to gray. A small table was bolted to the floor, its surface warped with moisture but still standing. But it was the back of the bus that made them all stop in their tracks. 2 beds had been built there, one larger one distinctly smaller. The smaller bed had rails on the side, the kind you'd put on a child's bed to keep them from rolling out. Above it, still somehow clinging to the wall despite the years, were drawings. Children's drawings done in crayon and marker, showing stick figures and suns, and what might have been trees or flowers. "A kid lived here," Clara whispered, and Daniel heard the mother's heartbreak in her voice. Matthew had gone uncharacteristically quiet, staring at the drawings. Some were at his eye level, as if drawn by someone about his height. There were alphabet letters practiced in shaky handwriting, numbers counted out, simple math problems worked through. On the wall beside the bed, scratched into the metal itself, were height marks, just like the ones they had on their kitchen door frame at home, marking Matthew's growth over the years. These started low, maybe 3 feet, and climbed to about 4.5 feet. Each mark had a date beside it, though years weren't included, just months and days. June 5th, September 22nd, December 1st. Daniel found himself imagining it, a parent carefully marking their child's growth, maintaining this ritual of normal life even in these extraordinary circumstances. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. "Dad, look at this." Matthew had moved to explore more of the living space and was pointing at something tucked into a corner. It was a wooden box, handmade from the looks of it, with dovetail joints that spoke of skill and care. The lid was closed but not locked. "Should we open it?" Matthew asked. Daniel hesitated. This felt different from just looking around. This felt like an invasion of privacy, even if the owners had been gone for years. But Clara nodded slightly. She was curious too. Inside the box were treasures that made them all catch their breath. A collection of small toys, a wooden horse carved with patient skill, a set of marbles in a leather pouch, a handful of metal cars, the paint worn off from handling. There were books, 2 children's books, their pages swollen with moisture, but still intact. Curious George. Where the Wild Things Are. Goodnight Moon. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in what had once been a plastic bag, was a photograph. The moisture had gotten to it, despite the protection making the image blurry and distorted, but they could make out 2 figures, an adult and a child, standing in front of the bus when it was newer, cleaner, when the yellow paint still shone. The adult's face was obscured by damage to the photo, but the child was clearer. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, with a gap-toothed grin and messy hair. "They look happy," Matthew said quietly. Daniel carefully returned the photograph to its plastic wrapping, feeling like he was handling something sacred. These weren't just abandoned possessions, they were memories, fragments of a life lived in this strange sanctuary. Clara had moved to examine the kitchen area more closely. "This is actually ingenious," she said, her practical mind appreciating the engineering. "Look how they've maximized every inch of space. Water collection system here, storage there. Someone really thought this through." She opened one of the cabinets, sending a small avalanche of objects tumbling out: tin cans, long since emptied, and rusted plastic containers cracked with age, and something that caught the light as it fell. Daniel picked it up, a wedding ring, Simple gold band sized for a man's finger. The weight of the ring in his palm felt significant heavy with implications. A man and his child living here in the woods. But where was the mother? The single adult bed, the man's ring abandoned in a cabinet. The story was starting to write itself in Daniel's mind, and it wasn't a happy one. "There's more stuff under here," Matthew announced. He had dropped to his knees and was peering under one of the bench seats. "I think it's like a storage compartment or something." Daniel helped him lift the hinged top of the bench, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside were more practical items, tools carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, spare parts for the bus, canned goods that had long since expired, their labels faded but still readable. And at the bottom, another wrapped bundle. This one was wrapped in canvas tied with rope that fell apart at Daniel's touch. Inside was a leather journal, its pages yellowed but protected from the worst of the moisture. Daniel opened it carefully, afraid the pages might crumble. The first page had a date, April 15th, 1992. "That's over 30 years ago," Clara calculated quickly. The handwriting was neat, careful, the pen strokes of someone taking their time. Day 1. "We made it to our new home. Timothy seems excited about the adventure. I've told him we're camping just for a while until things get better. He doesn't need to know the truth yet. The bus isn't much, but it's ours. No one will find us here. We can start over, just the two of us." Daniel felt Clara reading over his shoulder, felt her hand grip his arm as the implications sank in. He turned the page carefully. Day 3. "Got the stove working today. Timothy helped. He's so proud to be Daddy's assistant. He asks about Mommy. I told him she's in heaven with the angels. It's easier than explaining what really happened, maybe when he's older." Day 8. "Found a stream about a quarter-mile east. Clean water, lots of fish. Timothy caught his first minnow today with his bare hands. You should have seen his face. These are the moments I want him to remember." The entries continued documenting their daily life lessons learned about living in the woods, Timothy's education conducted with books salvaged from somewhere, the careful rationing of supplies, trips to town that were apparently rare and dangerous for reasons not explained. Daniel skipped ahead, drawn by a morbid curiosity to know how the story ended. September 20th. "Timothy's sick. Fever won't break. Thornton. I can't take him to a hospital. They'll take him away from me. I know how to treat this. I have to." September 22nd. "Fever broke last night. Thank God. He's weak but smiling. Asked for pancakes. We'll have to make the trip to town soon for supplies." October 1st. "They came looking today. Saw them from the ridge, 2 police cars at the old logging road. They don't know about the bus. We're safe, but we'll have to be more careful now." Clara had moved away, unable to read more. She was standing by the small bed again, looking at the drawings on the wall with tears in her eyes. Matthew had gone quiet, sensing the adult emotions in the room, even if he didn't fully understand them. Daniel flipped to the last entry. December 1st. "Timothy is 7 today. Made him a cake with the last of our flour. He's growing so fast," marked his height on the wall. 2 inches now. "He's asking more questions about why we can't go home. I'm running out of lies. Maybe the truth would be better. Maybe it's time to—" The entry stopped mid-sentence. There was nothing after that, just blank pages yellowing with age. "What happened to them?" Matthew asked, his voice small in the silence of the bus. "I don't know, buddy," Daniel answered honestly. "But it was a long time ago." They explored more carefully after that, finding other remnants of the life lived here. School workbooks filled out in a child's careful handwriting. A chess set with pieces carved from wood. Clothes folded neatly in a makeshift dresser sized for a growing boy. A guitar with broken strings leaning in a corner. Under the driver's seat, Daniel found another cache of documents. These more official: a birth certificate for Timothy James Walker. Born December 1st, 1985. No father's name listed, mother's name blacked out with marker. A social security card. A library card from a town 40 miles away. "We should go," Clara said suddenly. "This doesn't feel right. We're intruding." But even as she said it, none of them moved. There was something magnetic about this place, this mystery. It was like reading a book with the last chapters torn out. The need to know what happened was almost physical. "Look at this." Matthew had wandered to the front of the bus and was examining the dashboard. Tucked into the sun visor was another photograph, this one in better condition. It showed the same boy, older now, maybe 9 or 10, standing next to a man whose face was turned away from the camera, looking out over a vista of mountains. The boy was holding up a fish, grinning proudly. They were happy here, Matthew said with the certainty of a child. You can tell? Daniel wasn't sure about happy, but there was something in the photographs and the careful maintenance of routine and normalcy evident throughout the bus. Love. That's what he was seeing. Whatever had driven them here, whatever they were running from or toward, there had been love. Dad, there's something else. Matthew had found a loose panel near the floor. Behind it was a small space, and inside that space was a metal box, a cash box, the kind you might use for a yard sale or a school fundraiser. This one was locked, but the lock was small and had rusted through. It broke easily when Daniel applied pressure. Inside were more documents, these seemingly more important a driver's license for a James Walker, the photo showing a man in his 30s with kind eyes and a worried expression. There were newspaper clippings too brittle with age. Daniel unfolded one carefully. The headline read, "Local mother dies in domestic dispute, husband sought for questioning." The article was brief, the details sparse. Sarah Walker, 28, found dead in her home. Evidence of domestic violence. Husband James Walker missing along with their 6-year-old son Timothy. Police searching. Another clipping dated 2 weeks later, search continues for missing father and son. And another a month after that, Walker case goes cold, police fear the worst. He was protecting his son, Clara said quietly. She had read the articles over Daniel's shoulder. Maybe he didn't do it, maybe he did, but either way, he was protecting Timothy. Daniel carefully refolded the clippings and returned them to the box. The full story was starting to emerge, a tragedy that had driven a father and son into the woods, into this bus, into a life of hiding. Whether James Walker was guilty or innocent of his wife's death almost didn't matter now, 3 decades later. What mattered was that he had tried to give his son a life even here, even like this. They found one more significant item before they left, a package wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and duct tape hidden in the wheel well of the bus. Inside was money, maybe $3,000 in small bills, and a letter. The letter was addressed simply to "Whoever finds this." Daniel read it aloud. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me and Timothy. I pray you never have to read this, but I'm not a fool. I know our life here can't last forever. Timothy is innocent of everything. He's a good boy, smart and kind. If I'm gone and he's still alive, please make sure he's taken care of. The money is for him. There's an aunt in Portland, Rebecca Walker, at the address below. She'll take him in. Tell her Jimmy sent him. She'll understand. If we're both gone, then I guess it doesn't matter. But please know we were happy here. Happier than we ever were in the real world. Sometimes freedom isn't about doing whatever you want, it's about being able to protect the people you love. Take care of the bus if you can. It was our home. James Walker." The address for Rebecca Walker followed along with a phone number that was probably long out of service. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the story settling over them like dust. Outside, the forest had grown darker. Clouds were rolling in just as Clara had predicted. "We should report this," Clara said finally. "To someone. The police, or—" "Report what?" Daniel asked gently. "A 30-year-old bus with some old stuff in it. What would be the point?" "To give them closure," she said. "Their family, if they have any left." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "Or maybe we let them have their peace. They found it here in their way." Matthew had been quiet through all of this processing in his 10-year-old way. Now he spoke up. "I think they escaped." Both parents looked at him. "I think they left one day and went somewhere new, started over. Timothy grew up and became, I don't know, a teacher or something. And his dad, James, he became an old man who feeds birds in the park. And they're okay." Daniel ruffled his son's hair. "Maybe you're right, buddy. Maybe that's exactly what happened." They left the bus, then carefully closing the door behind them, trying to leave everything as they'd found it. The walk back to find the trail was subdued, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they'd discovered. By some miracle, or maybe just because they were paying better attention now, they found the original trail within 20 minutes. The orange blazes had never looked so welcoming. They made it back to the parking lot just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The drive home was quiet. Matthew fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional weight of their discovery as much as from the physical exertion of the hike. Clara stared out the window at the passing landscape, occasionally wiping her eyes. "Are we going to tell anyone?" she asked finally. Daniel thought about it for a long moment. "I did some quick math. If Timothy was 7 in 1992, he'd be nearly 40 now. If he's alive, he's made a life for himself somewhere. Coming forward now would only complicate things. And if he's not alive, then it doesn't matter either way." Clara nodded, accepting this logic, even if it didn't quite satisfy the itch to do something to help somehow. That night after Matthew was in bed, Daniel did search online for information about James and Timothy Walker. He found the old newspaper articles digitized now, but nothing after 1992. They had simply vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. He also searched for Rebecca Walker in Portland. He found an obituary from 2010. She had died at age 73, survived by 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. No mention of a nephew named Timothy. Daniel closed his laptop and went to check on Matthew. His son was asleep, but restlessly muttering something in his dreams. On his desk was a drawing he'd done after dinner, a yellow bus in green woods with 2 stick figures standing in front of it holding hands. In the morning, Matthew had questions. He wanted to know more about why someone would live in a bus, about what could make a father take his son away from everything. Daniel and Clara answered as best they could, talking about how sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan, how sometimes people have to make hard choices to protect the ones they love. "Would you ever do that?" Matthew asked his father. "Take me away to live in the woods if you had to." Daniel pulled his son close. "I'd do whatever it took to keep you safe," he said, and meant it. A week later, they went back. They couldn't help themselves. The pull of the mystery, the need to somehow honor what they'd found was too strong. This time they brought supplies not to take anything, but to leave something. They cleaned the bus as best they could, carefully, respectfully. Clara had brought flowers, wildflowers she'd picked from their garden, and placed them on the small bed where Timothy had slept. Matthew had written a note in his careful handwriting. "We found your home. We think you were brave. We hope you're okay." Daniel left the note on the dashboard where James Walker had once sat planning their days, teaching his son, watching for danger, hoping for peace. They also brought the journal to the local historical society, anonymously, with a note explaining where it had been found. The woman at the desk had promised to preserve it to make sure the story wasn't lost entirely. It seemed like the right balance, preserving the history while protecting the privacy of those involved. Months passed. The bus in the woods became a family secret, a story they shared only with each other. Sometimes Matthew would ask about it, wondering about Timothy, creating elaborate stories about what became of him. In Matthew's versions, Timothy always grew up happy, always found peace, always remembered his father with love rather than shame. The following spring, they hiked the trail again. When they reached the spot where they'd gotten lost, they thought about visiting the bus again but decided against it. Some things were better left as they were preserved in memory rather than revisited in reality. But Matthew had brought something, a small wooden boat he'd carved with his grandfather's help. Without saying anything, he walked a little way into the woods and placed it on a stump where it could be seen from the trail if you knew where to look. A marker, a memorial, a message to whoever might find it. Someone remembered, someone cared. Years later, when Matthew was grown with children of his own, he would tell them about the bus in the woods. By then, the story had taken on the quality of legend, the details softened by time and retelling. But the heart of it remained a father and son who had made a home in the most unlikely place, who had found love in loss, who had disappeared into mystery but left behind evidence of their humanity. Daniel never did find out what happened to James and Timothy Walker. The rational part of him suspected tragedy, illness, accident, discovery by authorities, any number of endings that wilderness and desperation might bring. But another part of him, the part that still believed in the possibility of grace, chose to believe Matthew's first instinct had been right. Somewhere, perhaps, Timothy Walker was living a quiet life. Maybe he was a teacher, as Matthew had imagined, passing on the lessons his father had taught him in that bus in the woods. Maybe he had a family of his own children he told about their grandfather, carefully edited stories that emphasized the love, rather than the fear. Or maybe not. Maybe the forest had claimed them as it eventually claimed the bus itself, slowly, gently, naturally. Maybe their story ended not with violence or capture, but with the simple cessation that comes to all living things there in their sanctuary together. Clara had been right about the trees. They had weathered storms unimaginable, stood witness to stories untold. The Bus in the Woods was just one story among thousands, millions that played out beneath the canopy. But it was their story now too, the Reed family's story woven into their own narrative in ways they were only beginning to understand. Daniel thought about James Walker often, especially on difficult days when the weight of parenthood felt overwhelming. He thought about the courage it must have taken to walk away from everything, the desperate love that could drive such a choice. He thought about the daily struggle to maintain normalcy in such abnormal circumstances, the careful balance between protection and preparation, the weight of secrets carried for a child's sake. The bus had taught him something about the lengths to which love could drive a person, the sacrifices that parenthood might demand. It had also taught him gratitude for the simple blessing of being able to raise his child in the open, without fear, without hiding. Sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings when Matthew would climb into their bed for family snuggle time, Daniel would think about those mornings in the bus, a father and son, waking to forest sounds starting their day in their strange sanctuary. Were those mornings filled with fear or peace? Did James Walker wake each day grateful for another day of freedom or dreading the knock that might come? The not knowing was part of the story. Now, part of what made it powerful. The Bus in the Woods existed in a space between reality and imagination, between history and legend. It was Schrödinger's sanctuary, simultaneously tragic and beautiful, a prison and a paradise, an ending and a beginning. The discovery haunted them in ways they hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks after finding the bus, Daniel woke at 3 a.m. to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, surrounded by printed pages. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red with exhaustion and something else, obsession maybe. "I can't stop thinking about them," she said simply. "About Timothy especially. He would be 39 now, Daniel. 39. What kind of life did he have after that bus? Did he even have a life after it?" Daniel pulled up a chair beside her, looking at the papers she'd printed. They were all related to missing persons cases from the early 1990s. Newspaper archives, records from Oregon and Washington state. She'd been digging deep using skills from her college journalism days that he'd forgotten she possessed. "I found something," Clara said, sliding a paper toward him. It was a scanned article from a small-town newspaper dated July 1993. The headline read, "Mysterious Boy Found Wandering Near Highway Unable or Unwilling to Speak." The article described a boy approximately 8 years old discovered by a truck driver walking along Highway 101 near the California-Oregon border. The child had no identification, refused to speak, and showed signs of prolonged exposure to the elements. He was placed in foster care while authorities tried to determine his identity. "You think it was Timothy?" Daniel asked, though he could see in Clara's eyes that she was certain. "Look at the date. 7 months after the last journal entry. And the age matches. The location is maybe 60 miles from where we found the bus. Clara, even if it was him, that was 30 years ago. The trail's cold." "I know," she said, but her fingers were already moving across the keyboard, searching for more. I need to know he was okay, that someone took care of him." Daniel understood. The story of the bus had burrowed into all of them in different ways. Matthew had been drawing pictures of it, constantly filling notebook after notebook with images of the yellow bus in various settings, sometimes in sunshine, sometimes in storms, always with 2 figures nearby, one tall, one small. The next morning was Saturday, and Matthew was up early, as always. He found his parents in the kitchen, both looking tired, the remnants of Clara's late-night research still scattered on the table. "Are we going back today?" Matthew asked, hopefully. He'd been asking the same question every weekend since their discovery. "Not today, buddy," Daniel said, but Clara interrupted. "Actually, I was thinking we might take a drive. Not to the bus, but to the town nearby. Millfield. I want to visit their library, look at some old newspapers." Daniel gave her a look that said they'd discuss this later, but Matthew was already excited. Can we get lunch there? Maybe someone remembers them? And that's how they found themselves 2 hours later pulling into the small town of Millfield, Oregon. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, one main street, a handful of shops, a diner that had probably looked exactly the same for 50 years. The library was a small brick building that might have been a bank once its windows tall and narrow. The librarian was an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who seemed delighted to have visitors interested in local history. When Clara carefully asked about any unusual events from the early 1990s, the woman's face changed. "Oh, you mean the Walker situation," she said quietly, glancing around even though they were alone in the local history section. "That was a terrible time. Terrible." Daniel felt his heart rate quicken. "You remember them?" "Hard to forget. James used to come into town maybe once a month, buy supplies. Always paid cash, never said much. Polite enough, but you could tell he was carrying something heavy. And the boy, sweet child, but so quiet. Too quiet for a young one." "When did you last see them?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment. "Must have been early December '92. James came in alone, which was unusual. He typically brought Timothy, bought more supplies than normal, like he was stocking up for something. He looked terrible thin and worried. I asked if everything was all right, and he just said they might be going away for a while. And after that, never saw them again. There were rumors, of course. Some said they saw lights in the woods that winter, heard things. Tom Bradley, he was a hunter, claimed he saw someone matching James's description up near Salmon Creek in January, but Tom drank, so nobody put much stock in it. She led them to a section of archived newspapers, helping them find the relevant dates. There, in black and white, were more pieces of the story. Not about James and Timothy directly, but about the search, about the speculation, about a community grappling with a mystery. One editorial from February 1993 caught Daniel's eye. "Sometimes mercy means looking the other way. Sometimes justice isn't what the law says it is. We may never know what happened to James Walker and his boy, but those of us who saw them together, who witnessed that father's devotion, we choose to believe they found their peace. May God grant them that wherever they are." "There was sympathy for them," Clara observed. "More than you'd think," Mrs. Patterson agreed. Sarah Walker, the wife her family had lived here for generations. The Hendersons. Not good people if you understand my meaning. Sarah tried to get away from them marrying James, but family has a way of pulling you back. When she died, well, there were some who thought James might have been defending himself, or defending the boy. "The Hendersons," Daniel said. "Are they still around?" Mrs. Patterson's expression darkened. "Best to leave that alone. Nothing good comes from digging into Henderson business." But Matthew, who had been quietly reading a children's book nearby, suddenly spoke up. "We found their bus." The silence that followed felt electric. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened, her hand going to her throat. "You found? Where?" Daniel wanted to silence Matthew, but it was too late. Clara explained carefully about their hike, about getting lost, about the discovery. She didn't mention taking anything or the journal, just that they'd found it and thought someone should know. Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily in a nearby chair. "All these years people wondered. We thought maybe they'd made it to Canada or California, but they were here all along, just a few miles into the forest. We don't know that they stayed there," Daniel said quickly. "The bus was abandoned. They might have left." "Yes," Mrs. Patterson said, but her eyes were distant. "They might have." She stood abruptly. "Excuse me a moment." She returned carrying a small box, the kind that might hold index cards. Inside were photographs, old ones, their edges yellowed. She sorted through them until she found what she was looking for. "Library fundraiser, summer of '92, she said, handing them a photo. "James brought Timothy. Only time I ever saw them at a social event." The photo showed a crowd of people at what looked like a fair or carnival. In the background, almost out of focus, were two figures, a tall man in a baseball cap and a small boy holding what might have been cotton candy. The man's hand was on the boy's shoulder, protective guiding. "May I?" Clara asked, and Mrs. Patterson nodded. Clara took a photo of the photograph with her phone, zooming in on the two figures. Even blurred, even distant, there was something about their posture that spoke of a unit, a team of two against the world. "There's someone else you might want to talk to," Mrs. Patterson said after a moment. "Though I'm not sure he'll be willing. Marcus Reed. He was a park ranger back then, retired now. Lives out on Elm Street, the blue house with the garden gnomes. He knew those woods better than anyone. If anyone might have known about the bus." They thanked Mrs. Patterson and left the library. Matthew chattering excitedly about their detective work while Daniel and Clara exchanged uncertain looks. This was becoming something more than just satisfying curiosity. The blue house on Elm Street was easy to find. The garden gnomes were impossible to miss, dozens of them arranged in what seemed like battle formation across the front yard. Marcus Reed answered the door after the third knock, a man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a suspicious expression. "Mr. Reed, my name is Daniel Reed. This is my wife Clara and our son Matthew. Mrs. Patterson at the library suggested we talk to you." "About what?" His voice was gruff, unwelcoming. "About James and Timothy Walker." The change in Reed's expression was immediate. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment Daniel thought he might slam the door in their faces. But then he seemed to see Matthew, and something in his face softened. "You'd better come in," he said. His living room was what you'd expect from an elderly bachelor: functional furniture, a massive television, and surprisingly, walls covered with topographical maps of the local area. Reed noticed Daniel looking. 30 years a ranger, he said. Old habits. They sat awkwardly on a plaid couch while Reed settled into what was clearly his chair, worn to fit his shape perfectly. "Now, why are you asking about the Walkers after all this time?" Clara started to explain about the hike, but Reed held up a hand. "I know about the bus," he said quietly. "Known for years." The silence that followed was profound. Matthew broke it with a child's directness. "Then why didn't you tell anyone?" Reed looked at the boy for a long moment. "You ever been hunted, son? Ever been so scared that living in a broken-down bus in the woods seemed like the better option?" Matthew shook his head. "James Walker was a good man in an impossible situation. I found their camp, the bus, in late '92. Could have reported it. Should have, according to the law. But I saw how they were living, saw the care he was taking with that boy, teaching him, raising him right despite everything, so I made a decision." "You helped them," Clara said, not a question. Reed neither confirmed nor denied it. "I did my job, kept the woods safe. Sometimes that means knowing when to see something and when to be blind." "What happened to them?" Daniel asked. "The journal we found?" He stopped, realizing he'd admitted to taking something. Reed's smile was bitter. "Journal, huh?" "James always was writing in that thing. Recording everything for posterity," he said. "In case something happened, and Timothy needed to know the truth someday." He stood walked to one of the maps on the wall. His finger traced a path through the topographical lines. Winter of '92 was harsh. Early snow temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks. Living in that bus with no proper heating, limited food. I did what I could, leaving supplies where they'd find them, making sure the paths stayed clear, but there's only so much one man can do without raising suspicions. "Did they make it through the winter?" Clara asked softly. Reed was quiet for a long moment. "Last time I saw James was January 15th, '93. He was at the creek getting water. Looked like a ghost, thin, exhausted, but still going. Still fighting. I left a package on a stump near the bus: food, medicine, some warmer clothes for the boy. When I came back a week later, the package was gone, but so were they. Gone. Bus was empty. Cleaned out. Not abandoned in a hurry, but purposefully vacated. They took everything important, left the rest neat and tidy. Like they were going on a trip and might come back, but knew they probably wouldn't." "Where would they have gone?" Daniel asked. Reed shrugged. "Could have gone anywhere. North to Canada. Border wasn't as tight back then. South to California, get lost in the cities. East to the mountains, find another place to hide. Or," he trailed off, or nowhere. Winter in those woods, especially for people already weakened. Bodies wouldn't last long. Animals weather time. Nature reclaims everything eventually." Matthew had gone pale. Clara pulled him closer, but he squirmed away. "They didn't die," he said firmly. "Timothy grew up. He's out there somewhere." Reed studied the boy. "Maybe you're right, son. I like to think that too." James was resourceful, and he'd have done anything for that boy. Anything. He moved to an old filing cabinet in the corner, pulled out a manila envelope. Never showed this to anyone. Figured if they were alive, they deserved their privacy. If they weren't, well, what was the point? Inside the envelope was a single photograph, clearer than any they'd seen so far. It showed James Walker in profile carrying Timothy on his shoulders. The boy was laughing, his arms spread wide like airplane wings. The photo was taken from a distance through trees Reed had been watching them, documenting them, protecting them in his way. That was summer '92, Reed said, before things got bad, before the winter. That's how I choose to remember them. Mr. Reed, Clara said carefully, the boy who was found on Highway 101 in July '93, the one who wouldn't speak. Do you think— I know about that boy, Reed interrupted. Followed that story closely. They never identified him, placed him with a family in Eugene. Last I heard, which was years ago, he was doing well. New name, new life. Whether it was Timothy or not, that boy got a chance. That's what matters. They left Reed's house with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of completion. The story was coming together even if the ending remained ambiguous. That evening, back at their hotel, Clara had insisted they stay overnight, not ready to leave this thread unpulled. She sat with her laptop again while Daniel gave Matthew a bath. I found something, she called out, her voice tight with excitement. Daniel came out. Matthew wrapped in a towel, dripping and curious. The boy from Highway 101, the one Reed mentioned. I found a follow-up article from 1995. He was adopted by a family named the Carters, David and Helen Carter, from Eugene, and look, she turned the screen toward them. Their adopted son's name, they called him Timothy. That's not uncommon, Daniel pointed out, even as his heart raced. No, but look at this. She pulled up another window, a social media profile. Timothy Carter, age 39, living in Portland. Teacher at Roosevelt Elementary. And his profile picture. The man in the photo was unremarkable, average height, brown hair going gray at the temples. Kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But there was something in the shape of his face, the set of his jaw, that reminded Daniel of the blurred figure in Mrs. Patterson's photograph. We can't know for sure, he said, even as he studied the image. But what if it is him? Clara asked. What if Timothy Walker became Timothy Carter and he's been living just a few hours away all this time? Then he's living the life his father wanted for him, Daniel said. Normal, safe, free. Matthew, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke. We should write him a letter. Matthew, we can't just— Not to tell him we know, Matthew continued, just to tell him about the bus, in case he wants to go back someday. To remember. Clara and Daniel exchanged looks over their son's head. The innocence of the suggestion was touching, but the implications were complex. If Timothy Carter was Timothy Walker, did he remember the bus? Did he remember his father? Did he want to? That night, unable to sleep, Daniel found himself composing a letter in his head. Not to send, just to organize his thoughts. Dear Mr. Carter, it would begin. You don't know us, but we found something that might have belonged to someone you once knew. A father who loved his son more than anything. A man who gave up everything to keep his child safe. But he knew he'd never send it. Some stories were meant to stay unfinished, at least for the outside observers. If Timothy Carter was that boy from the bus, he'd made his choice to move forward, not back. Who were they to disturb that? The next morning, they prepared to leave Millfield. But first, Clara insisted on one more stop. The Eugene newspaper office, where she'd found many of the articles, had mentioned a reporter, Susan Blackwood, who had covered the Walker story extensively. She was retired now, but still lived in town. They found Susan Blackwood at a coffee shop she apparently frequented every morning. She was in her 80s now, sharp-eyed and elegant, with silver hair pinned in a careful bun. When Clara approached her and mentioned the Walker case, her expression became guarded. That's ancient history, she said. Why are you digging it up now? Clara explained about finding the bus, and Susan's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. After all these years, she murmured. We all wondered where they'd gone. She agreed to talk, but insisted they go somewhere more private. Her apartment was nearby, filled with books and newspapers, the home of someone who'd spent their life documenting other people's stories. I was obsessed with that case, Susan admitted, pulling out a thick folder from a filing cabinet. Something about it haunted me. A father and son disappeared into thin air. The police were convinced James had killed the boy and himself, but I never believed it. Why not? Susan spread out her collected articles, notes, photographs. Because I'd met James Walker, interviewed him once years before Sarah died for a piece about local small businesses. He ran an auto repair shop. He was gentle, patient, devoted to his family. When Sarah died, the police immediately suspected him, but those of us who knew him, we knew better. What do you think happened to Sarah? Daniel asked. Susan was quiet for a moment. Sarah Walker was trapped between two worlds, the one she'd grown up in, with a family that saw violence as a solution to everything, and the one she'd tried to build with James. Her brothers, the Henderson boys, they didn't approve of James. Too soft, they said. Not their kind. The night Sarah died, the Hendersons were seen at a bar drinking heavily, talking about teaching someone a lesson. You think they killed her? I think something went very wrong that night. Whether they meant to kill her or just hurt James and she got in the way, we'll never know. But James knew he'd never get justice, not with the Hendersons' connections. And he knew they'd come for Timothy, eventually claim their blood. So he ran. And you never wrote about this? Clara asked. Susan's smile was sad. I wrote it. My editor killed it. The Hendersons had reach even then. The official story was that James was a suspect who'd fled. That was the only story allowed. She pulled out one more item, a cassette tape, old and worn. James called me once, about a month after they disappeared, from a payphone somewhere far away. He wanted someone to know the truth. She had an old tape player, and after some fiddling, got it to work. James Walker's voice filled the room, tinny and distant, through the old speakers. Susan, it's James. I know you've been fair in your reporting, so I wanted you to know we're okay. Timothy's safe, that's what matters. We found a place somewhere they won't find us. I'm teaching him myself math, reading, science. He's so smart, Susan, asks questions about everything. Why the leaves change color where the stars go during the day, why people hurt each other. That last one I can't answer. There was a pause, the sound of traffic in the background. I know what people think. I know what they're saying. Let them. The truth doesn't matter if my boy is safe. We have what we need. It's not the life I planned for him, but it's a life. He laughs every day. That has to count for something. Another pause. If something happens to me, there are people who will take care of him. Good people. He'll be okay. Tell the world whatever story it needs to hear. Just remember us kindly, if you remember us at all. The tape clicked off. In the silence that followed, Daniel heard Clara crying softly. Even Matthew was affected, staring at the tape player as if it might speak again. I've kept that tape for 30 years, Susan said. Never played it for anyone else. But since you found their home, you should hear his voice. Know that whatever else he was, James Walker was a father who loved his son. They left Susan's apartment with copies of some of her materials she insisted said someone should have them. The drive home was quiet, each of them processing what they'd learned. The story of the bus had become something larger, a tragedy, a love story, a mystery that might never be fully solved. As they reached the outskirts of their own city, Matthew spoke from the back seat. I want to be a teacher. Yeah, Daniel said, catching his son's eye in the rearview mirror. Why's that? Because if Timothy became a teacher, it means he wanted to keep doing what his dad did, teaching kids, helping them learn. It means the good parts stayed with him. Clara reached back and squeezed Matthew's knee. That's a beautiful thought, sweetheart. That evening, while Matthew played in his room, Daniel and Clara sat on their back porch sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset. The everyday normalcy of it felt almost surreal after the intensity of the past 2 days. Are we going to do anything with all this? Clara asked. Susan's materials, the tape, everything we know. Daniel considered it. What would be the point if Timothy Carter is Timothy Walker? He's built a life. If he's not, then Timothy Walker is gone and his father would want it that way. Either way, our interference would only cause harm. But the bus should stay where it is, a monument to a father's love hidden in the forest where they found sanctuary. Clara nodded, accepting this. But Daniel could see she wasn't entirely at peace with it. The mother in her needed to know that Timothy was truly okay, truly safe, truly loved. 2 weeks later, Clara did something she probably shouldn't have. She went to Roosevelt Elementary in Portland during their spring fair, a public event where anyone could attend. She told Daniel she was visiting her sister, but he knew where she really went. He didn't try to stop her. She came home that evening with red eyes and a strange smile. "I saw him," she said simply. "Timothy Carter. He was running a ring toss game surrounded by kids. He was patient with them, funny kind. One little girl was crying because she couldn't win, and he knelt down and helped her, guiding her hand until she got the ring on the post. The way he celebrated with her. Daniel, he's a good man. Whatever happened in those woods, however he got from there to here, he became a good man." "Did you talk to him?" "No, I just watched. But at one point a parent asked him why he became a teacher. And you know what he said? He said a teacher saved his life once. Taught him that learning could happen anywhere, that love was the most important lesson, that being different didn't mean being less than." Daniel pulled her close. His father. His father. They never went back to the bus, though they thought about it often. They never contacted Timothy Carter, though Clara occasionally checked his social media, noting his milestones, an engagement, a wedding, the adoption of a daughter of his own. Each update was proof that James Walker's sacrifice had meant something, that love could transcend tragedy. 5 years passed before the bus called them back. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like gravity, an invisible force that pulled at them during quiet moments. Matthew was 15 now, taller than his mother, his voice cracking between childhood and manhood. He'd kept drawing the bus over the years, his artistic skills improving until the sketches became almost photographic in their detail. One evening, Daniel found him working on a particularly elaborate piece, the bus surrounded by seasons, spring on one side, winter on the other, as if time itself was splitting around it. "I want to go back," Matthew said without looking up from his drawing, "before I leave for college, before everything changes." Daniel understood. His son was standing at his own threshold, about to step from one life into another. The bus had become something mythic in their family story, a touchstone for discussions about courage, sacrifice, and love. It seemed right to visit it once more to see what time had done to their secret. Clara agreed immediately. She'd been different since her clandestine trip to see Timothy Carter, carrying a kind of peaceful sadness, like someone who'd read the last page of a beautiful book and knew there would never be a sequel. She never spoke about going back to Portland, never suggested they make contact. But sometimes Daniel caught her staring at nothing, and he knew she was thinking about that elementary school, about a man teaching children with the same patience his father had shown him in a broken-down bus. They prepared for the trip differently this time. Matthew packed a proper camera, wanting to document what might be their last visit. Clara brought flowers again, but also something else, a laminated letter she'd written, but would never send, addressed to the boy who lived here. But Daniel brought tools, thinking he might secure anything that was coming loose, preserve what could be preserved. The morning they left was unseasonably warm for October Indian summer, casting golden light through their kitchen windows. Matthew was quieter than he'd been as a child, the excited chatter replaced by thoughtful observation. He sat in the front seat now. When had he gotten old enough for that? His long legs cramped even with the seat pushed back. "Dad," he said as they drove through the familiar countryside, "do you think we did the right thing? Not telling anyone about the bus?" It was a question Daniel had asked himself countless times. "I think we did the kind thing. Sometimes that's the same as the right thing, sometimes it's not. But kindness rarely leads you too far astray." The parking area at the trailhead was more developed than it had been 5 years ago. A proper ranger station had been built, and there were more cars, more signs, more evidence of the outside world, encroaching on what had been wilderness. Daniel felt a spike of panic had the trail system been expanded. Had someone else found the bus? But as they hiked following the now familiar path, he saw that the main trails remained the same. It was only when they deliberately left the marked path, pushing through undergrowth that had grown thicker in 5 years, that Daniel allowed himself to breathe again. The forest had kept its secret. The bus appeared through the trees like a vision from a dream, more consumed by nature than before. Vines had completely covered one side, and a small tree had actually grown through one of the windows, its branches reaching out like arms. The yellow paint was almost entirely gone now, leaving bare metal that had rusted to the color of autumn leaves. "It's beautiful," Matthew said, and Daniel understood what he meant. There was something profound about watching nature reclaim this human artifact, transforming it into something that belonged to the forest. The door was harder to open this time, swollen with moisture and blocked by debris. It took both Daniel and Matthew working together to force it wide enough to enter. Inside, the decay had accelerated. The ceiling had partially collapsed in one section, letting in shafts of light that illuminated clouds of dust motes. The makeshift furniture was collapsing, returning to its component parts. The drawings on the wall near Timothy's bed had faded to shadows barely visible. But something new had been added. On the driver's seat, protected from the worst of the weather by the intact windshield, was an envelope. Modern white, unopened. Daniel's hand shook as he picked it up. It was addressed simply to those who found this place. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. "I don't know who you are, but thank you. I've known about your visits for years, the flowers that appeared, the subtle signs of care. I came back here once about 10 years ago, drawn by something I couldn't name. Memory, maybe, or the need to see if it was real. It was smaller than I remembered, and larger too, if that makes sense. I was 7 when we left this place. Old enough to remember, young enough that the memories feel more like dreams. I remember my father's hands always gentle, even when they shook with fear. I remember lessons by candlelight, his voice patient as he explained why the rain fell, how the seasons changed, why we couldn't go back to the world we'd known. He told me we were on an adventure. Even then, I knew it was more than that. Children know when their parents are afraid, no matter how well they hide it. But he made our fear bearable by sharing it, by facing it together. The winter was hard. I was sick for weeks, burning with fever, while he held me, sang to me, begged me to stay with him. When I recovered, he was skeletal, having given me most of his food. That's when I knew we couldn't stay. A child's logic is simple. My father was dying for me, so we had to leave so he could live. I don't remember much about leaving, just walking for what felt like forever. His hand in mine until we couldn't walk anymore. Someone found me, actually. By then he was gone. Not dead, not physically, but gone somewhere inside himself where I couldn't follow. They said it was exhaustion, malnutrition exposure. I knew it was heartbreak. He'd kept himself alive long enough to get me to safety, and then he let go. They put me in foster care. Later I was adopted by wonderful people who gave me a new name, a new life, a chance to be normal. But I never forgot Timothy Walker, the boy who lived in a bus with his father, who learned that love could exist anywhere, even in exile. I became a teacher because of him, because he taught me that education isn't about buildings or books or boards of education. It's about one person refusing to let another remain in darkness. Every day I try to be for my students what he was for me, patient, kind, believing in their potential, even when the world seems impossible. I have a daughter now. Her name is Sarah. After a grandmother, she'll never know whose story she'll learn when she's older. Sometimes I tell her sanitized stories about the bus, about camping in the forest with my father, about adventures in the woods. She loves these stories, begs for more. Someday when she's older, I'll tell her the truth, about courage and sacrifice, and the lengths to which love can drive us. I'm leaving this note because I sense you understand. The flowers you left, the care you took, these are the acts of people who recognize sacred ground when they find it. This bus is a monument to a father's love, and you've been its guardians. Thank you for that. I won't be back. This place belongs to the past, and I've learned to live in the present. But knowing it exists, knowing someone remembers knowing the story, hasn't been entirely lost. That matters more than you might imagine. If you have children, hold them closer tonight. Tell them you love them. Teach them something, anything, with patience and joy. That's the only memorial my father would have wanted. Timothy. Clara was crying openly by the time Daniel finished reading the letter aloud. Matthew stood frozen, staring at the paper as if it might disappear. The bus felt different now, not abandoned but consecrated, acknowledged by the one person who had the right to define what it meant. "He knows we found it," Matthew whispered. "He knows we cared." They spent the rest of the day in and around the bus, no longer feeling like intruders but like invited guests. Clara placed her flowers and her laminated letter on Timothy's small bed, adding to the memorial. Matthew took photographs, but respectfully documenting rather than exploiting. Daniel did what repairs he could, knowing they were ultimately futile but needing to make the gesture anyway. As the afternoon sun slanted low through the trees, they heard voices approaching through the forest. Daniel's first instinct was to hide to protect the secret, but then he realized the futility of it. The bus had been found by them by Timothy, and eventually it would be found by others. Perhaps it was time. The voices belonged to a young couple, probably in their 20s, who emerged from the undergrowth looking lost and excited in equal measure. "Oh!" the woman exclaimed, seeing the reeds. "We didn't expect to find anyone else here." "Are you lost?" Daniel asked, though he suspected they weren't, not really. "We heard about an abandoned bus in these woods," the man said almost apologetically. "Urban legend stuff, you know. We didn't think it was real." Matthew stepped forward, surprising Daniel with his maturity. "It's real. A father and son lived here once a long time ago. They were hiding from something or someone. The father taught the son everything he could, kept him safe, loved him. They survived here for almost a year before they had to leave." The couple looked stunned, whether by the story or by Matthew's serious delivery of it. "Is it okay if we look inside?" the woman asked. Clara and Daniel exchanged glances. It wasn't their decision to make, not really. The bus belonged to the forest now, to history, to anyone who needed to find it. "Be respectful," Clara said simply. This was someone's home, someone's whole world. As the couple explored the bus with appropriate awe, Matthew pulled his parents aside. "More people are going to come, aren't they? Now that the story's getting out." "Probably," Daniel admitted. "Maybe that's okay," Matthew said, surprising them. "Maybe the story needs to be told. Not the names, not the specifics that could hurt anyone, but the story itself. About what people will do for love. About how even in the darkest places there can be light." They left the young couple at the bus, making their way back through the forest as shadows lengthened. The hike back felt different, not like an ending, but like a transition. The secret they'd carried for 5 years was spreading, becoming something larger than their personal discovery. That evening in their hotel room, Matthew posted one of his photographs online. Just the exterior of the bus wreathed in vines and shadow, with a simple caption, "Sometimes the most beautiful monuments are the ones nobody meant to build. A father loved his son here. That's all that matters." The post went viral within days. Thousands of people shared it, adding their own stories of parental sacrifice, of love in difficult circumstances, of homes found in unexpected places. Someone started a hashtag #BusInTheWoods. People began making pilgrimages to find it, leaving flowers, notes, small tokens of recognition. Marcus Reed called Daniel a week later. "So it's out there now," he said without preamble. "I'm sorry," Daniel began, but Reed cut him off. "Don't be. Maybe it's time. Secrets have a way of rotting if you keep them too long. At least now the story's being told with kindness." Susan Blackwood. The retired reporter published a piece in the local paper not exposing Timothy Carter or revealing specifics that could identify anyone, but telling the broader story of love loss and redemption. She ended it with a line that would become oft quoted, "Some people build monuments to love in marble and stone. James Walker built his in the patience of daily lessons, and the faithfulness of staying when leaving would have been easier, and the courage of letting go when holding on would have been selfish." The Hendersons, those specters from the past who had haunted the story, never came forward. Perhaps they were gone, or perhaps they simply recognized that their version of events had lost its power. The narrative had been claimed by love rather than violence, by sacrifice rather than suspicion. Winter came early that year, and Daniel found himself thinking about that bus buried in snow, about James Walker trying to keep his son warm, about the decision to leave. That must have been agonizing. He thought about Timothy Carter teaching his classes, raising his daughter, carrying his father's lessons forward in ways James could never have imagined. One evening in December, Clara showed him something on her computer. It was a crowdfunding page. Someone had started to create a proper memorial at the bus site, not to commercialize it, but to preserve it, to add a plaque that would tell the story without names, to maintain a trail so people could find it safely. "Should we contribute?" she asked. "Anonymously," Daniel suggested, and she nodded. They donated enough to ensure the project would succeed, then watched over the following months as it took shape. The trail was marked but not paved, keeping the journey difficult enough to deter casual visitors. The bus itself was stabilized but not restored, allowed to continue its gradual merger with the forest. A small plaque was installed on a nearby tree, reading simply, "Love lived here, 1992 to 1993. A father and son found sanctuary in this place and in each other. May all who visit find what they're looking for." Matthew graduated high school that spring, his valedictorian speech surprising everyone by focusing on the concept of unconventional education. He talked about learning that happened outside classrooms, about teachers who never held formal credentials, about wisdom passed down in desperate circumstances. He never mentioned the bus specifically, but his parents knew where the inspiration came from. "I've been accepted to Portland State," he told them afterward at the celebratory dinner. "I'm going to study education." Daniel and Clara exchanged glances. Portland, where Timothy Carter taught. The coincidence felt like something more. "That's wonderful, honey," Clara said carefully. "What made you choose Portland?" Matthew's smile was knowing. "They have an excellent education program, and maybe I'll get to learn from someone special, even if he never knows why I chose his class." Daniel wanted to argue to suggest this was crossing a line they'd been careful to maintain. But looking at his son, nearly a man now thoughtful and kind, and carrying the weight of this story with grace, he stayed silent. Matthew had earned the right to make this choice. As summer turned toward fall and Matthew prepared to leave for college, the three of them made one final pilgrimage to the bus. It had become a known destination now, though still remote enough that they found themselves alone on a Tuesday morning. The bus looked different with its official recognition. The trail was clearer, the plaque gleamed on its tree, and there were signs that many feet had traveled this path. But the essence remained unchanged. It was still a sanctuary, still a monument to love that transcended circumstance. Matthew had brought something, a metal box, like the one they'd found Timothy's toys in, but new. Inside, he'd placed his own offerings, a copy of his valedictorian speech, a photograph of the three of them at the bus from their first visit, and a letter. He read the letter aloud before sealing it in the box. "To whoever finds this in another 5, 10, or 30 years. This place taught my family that love isn't constrained by walls or limited by resources. It exists wherever people choose to nurture it. James Walker and his son Timothy proved that here and their story changed us. I'm going to become a teacher because of what happened here. Not because of the tragedy that drove them to this place, but because of the triumph of maintaining humanity in impossible circumstances. Every child I teach, I'll try to see through James Walker's eyes as someone worthy of patience, of knowledge, of hope. The bus is decomposing, being reclaimed by the forest. Someday it will be gone entirely. But what happened here, the love, the sacrifice, the proof that humans can create light in the darkest places that's eternal. It doesn't need a monument because it lives in everyone who knows the story, everyone who tells it, everyone who understands that sometimes running away is really running towards something better. If you're reading this, you're part of the story now. Carry it gently. Share it wisely. Remember that somewhere out there, Timothy Walker is living proof that love wins, even when it seems to lose. Matthew Reed, 2023 inches. He buried the box near the base of the tree, with the plaque marking its location with a small cairn of stones. As they walked back through the forest one last time, as a complete family unit, Matthew would be leaving for Portland in a week. Daniel felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for years. That night in Matthew's room as he packed, Daniel found him looking at a printout from Portland State's website. It was a faculty page for Roosevelt Elementary showing their partner teachers who worked with student teachers. Timothy Carter's photo was there, older now, but unmistakably the same kind eyes. "Are you going to tell him?" Daniel asked. "When you meet him?" Matthew considered this for a long moment. "No, I don't think so. He wrote that letter for us, but also to close that chapter. He doesn't need to know that his story inspired someone else to teach. He just needs to keep being the good man his father raised him to be. And if he recognizes something in you, if he sees that you know," Matthew smiled wise beyond his 18 years, "then we'll have a moment of understanding and we'll let it pass. Some connections don't need words." Clara appeared in the doorway holding an envelope. "This came for you," she told Matthew. "Portland State. Looks like housing information. Matthew opened it, scanned the contents. His expression shifted to something like wonder. "I've been assigned to Walker Hall." The silence that followed was full of meaning. Walker was a common enough name, it could be coincidence. But in the logic of their story, the narrative that had been unfolding since they first found the bus, it felt like something else, like the universe acknowledging the threads that connected them all. "Walker Hall," Clara repeated softly. "Of course." As Daniel lay in bed that night, Clara already asleep beside him, he thought about the strange journey that had begun with a simple family hike. They'd found a bus, yes, but more than that, they'd found a story that had changed them all. Matthew was heading toward his future shaped by the past they'd discovered. Clara had found peace in knowing Timothy was safe and thriving. And Daniel had learned something about the weight and power of other people's secrets, about the responsibility of bearing witness to someone else's pain and triumph. The bus would continue its slow dissolution into the forest, visited by strangers who would project their own meanings onto its rusted frame. Timothy Carter would continue teaching, never knowing that one of his student teachers had chosen that path because of him. James Walker's remains, wherever they rested, would lie undisturbed by revelation or recognition. But the story would live on, passed from person to person, changing slightly with each telling, but maintaining its essential truth that love transcends circumstance, that sacrifice can be beautiful, that even in exile and isolation, humans can create sanctuaries of meaning. Daniel turned toward Clara, pulled her closer in sleep. Tomorrow they would drive Matthew to Portland, help him settle into Walker Hall, maybe catch a glimpse of the elementary school where Timothy Carter taught. They would begin the next chapter of their own story, one indelibly marked by their discovery in the woods. The bus had done its work. It had sheltered James and Timothy when they needed it most, and then decades later it had sheltered the Reeds in a different way, giving them a story that would bind them together, a mystery that had taught them about love's endurance, a secret that had become a gift. Outside, October wind moved through the trees, carrying leaves and time and stories toward their unknown destinations. Somewhere in Portland, Timothy Carter was probably grading papers or preparing lessons, unconsciously passing on what his father had taught him in a broken-down bus. Somewhere in the forest, moonlight was falling on that same bus now, more monument than vehicle, more poem than prose. And in their suburban home, three people who had stumbled into someone else's story slept peacefully, carrying the weight and wonder of what they'd found, what they'd preserved, and what they'd chosen to let go. The drive to Portland took place on a morning when fog hung low over the valleys, making the world seem smaller and more intimate. Matthew sat in the back seat despite being old enough for the front, wanting to take in this last journey as a child being delivered by his parents rather than as the adult he was becoming. His boxes and bags filled the trunk and most of the back seat, the accumulated necessities of a new life pressing against the windows. Clara had been quiet since they'd left home, her hand occasionally reaching back to touch Matthew's knee or adjust something that didn't need adjusting. Daniel caught her wiping her eyes twice before they'd even reached the interstate. This was different from the day they'd found the bus, different from all their subsequent visits. This was their own story, intersecting with the one they'd discovered their son walking deliberately into the wake of that long-ago tragedy and triumph. "Tell me again about the first time," Matthew said as they passed through the forests outside the city. "When I spotted the bus through the trees." It had become a family tradition, this retelling. Each of them remembered different details, noticed different moments. Clara always emphasized the drawings on the wall, how they'd reminded her of Matthew's own artwork at that age. Daniel focused on the journal, the careful documentation of a life that refused to be erased. Matthew himself remembered the toys, the evidence that even in hiding, even in fear, there had been play. "You were so excited," Clara said, her voice soft with memory, "but also scared. You kept asking if someone still lived there, if we were trespassing." "We were trespassing," Daniel pointed out, as he always did. "On a place," Matthew said, completing the familiar exchange, "but not on a story. Stories belong to whoever needs them." Portland emerged from the fog like a city from a fairy tale, its bridges spanning the Willamette River like sentences connecting paragraphs. They'd been here before, of course, Clara's secret visit to see Timothy Carter, their careful reconnaissance of the city that would become Matthew's home. But this felt different, permanent, in a way that made Daniel's chest tight. Walker Hall stood on the edge of Portland State's campus, a brick building from the 1960s that had been renovated just enough to be functional, but not enough to be charming. Matthew's room was on the third floor, a double with a view of the city skyline. His roommate hadn't arrived yet, leaving them free to arrange Matthew's things without negotiation. Clara had brought photos to decorate his desk, family pictures from various hiking trips, including one from their first visit to the bus, though you couldn't tell what was in the background. She'd also framed one of Matthew's early drawings of the bus, the one where he'd depicted it surrounded by light, like something holy. "You don't have to display that," she said as Matthew positioned it on his shelf. "If it's too much to explain to people." "I want to," Matthew said. "When people ask, I'll tell them it's a place where I learned something important about love. That's enough truth for anyone who doesn't need the whole story." They spent the morning setting up the room, but by early afternoon there was nothing left to do but say goodbye. Matthew walked them back to the car, the three of them moving slowly, as if they could postpone the inevitable through decreased velocity. "There's something I need to tell you," Matthew said as they reached the car. "I've already been to Roosevelt Elementary." Daniel and Clara both turned to stare at him. "Not inside," Matthew clarified quickly. "Just walked past. It's only about 2 miles from here," and he paused, seeming to gather courage. "I saw him. Timothy Carter. He was out front with his class teaching them about leaves, why they change color in fall. The exact same lesson his father must have taught him in the woods." "Matthew," Clara started, but he held up a hand. "I didn't approach him. I won't not, unless it happens naturally through the program. But seeing him there real and alive and teaching it made everything click into place. Why I'm here, what I'm supposed to do. I'm not here to solve the mystery or provide closure or dig up the past. I'm here to continue something, to be part of a chain that started with James Walker teaching his son in impossible circumstances and continues with that son teaching others and will continue with me teaching whoever comes next." Daniel pulled his son into a fierce hug, feeling the boy's height, his solidity, his transformation into someone who could carry stories forward without breaking under their weight. Clara joined them, and for a moment they stood there in the parking lot. Three people bound by blood and by a narrative they'd accidentally entered 5 years ago. After his parents left, Matthew walked the 2 miles to Roosevelt Elementary. He didn't plan to go in just to walk past again to orient himself to this place that had become mythical in his imagination. But as he approached, he saw something that made him stop. Timothy Carter was sitting on a bench outside the school, alone reading a book. It was after school hours, the playground empty except for a janitor collecting forgotten lunch boxes. Matthew knew he should keep walking, but his feet carried him to a bench nearby where he sat and pretended to check his phone. "First year at Portland State." The voice made Matthew jump. Timothy Carter was looking at him with those kind eyes from the photographs, a slight smile on his face. "How did you know?" Matthew managed. "The lanyard." Timothy gestured to the Portland State orientation lanyard still hanging from Matthew's pocket. "Plus, you have that look, excited but terrified. I see it in my first graders every September." "You teach here?" Matthew asked, though of course he knew. 20 years now. Started right out of college." Timothy closed his book. Matthew could see it was about childhood development. "You in the education program?" "Planning to be." Timothy's smile widened. "Good. We need good teachers. It's the most important job that everyone thinks they could do better, but few actually can." He stood gathering his things. "Can I give you some advice?" Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice. "Remember that every child you teach is somebody's entire world, even the ones who seem like nobodies, especially those ones. Teach them like someone who loves them is watching, even if nobody is." He started to walk away, then turned back. "I'm Timothy, by the way. Timothy Carter. If you end up student teaching here, maybe I'll see you around." "Matthew," he managed. "Matthew Reed." Timothy nodded and walked away, leaving Matthew on the bench with his heart hammering. The interaction had been so normal, so unremarkable, except for the weight of everything Timothy didn't know that Matthew had stood in his childhood bedroom, read his father's journal, touched the toys he'd played with in hiding. That night, Matthew called his parents and told them about the encounter. Clara cried, of course, and Daniel had to clear his throat several times before speaking. He gave you advice about teaching, Daniel finally said. The same advice his father lived by in that bus. Every child is somebody's entire world, Matthew repeated. He was James Walker's entire world, and James was his. The semester progressed with a strange sense of destiny. Matthew threw himself into his education courses, finding that the passion he'd thought might be manufactured was actually genuine. He loved learning about child development, about different pedagogical approaches, about the psychology of learning. His professors commented on his unusual maturity, his perspective on education as something that could happen anywhere under any circumstances. He didn't see Timothy Carter again for months, though he often walked past Roosevelt Elementary. Sometimes he'd see Timothy's class outside studying nature or playing educational games. Always Timothy was patient, engaged, treating each child's question or concern as if it were the most important thing in the world. In November, an early snowstorm hit Portland, unusual for the area. Matthew was walking back from class when he passed Roosevelt just as school was letting out. The snow had created chaos, buses running late, parents stuck in traffic, children waiting in the cafeteria for rides that were slow in coming. He saw Timothy Carter standing outside with a small girl who was crying. She was maybe 6. Timothy's own age when he'd lived in the bus. Timothy was kneeling in the snow, his pants getting soaked, talking to her quietly. Matthew couldn't help himself. He approached careful to seem non-threatening. Everything okay? Timothy looked up, recognized him. Oh, Matthew, right. From a few months ago. At Matthew's nod, he continued. This is Lily. Her mom's stuck in traffic, and she's worried she's been forgotten. I'm not forgotten, Lily said through tears. But what if she is? What if Mommy's car is stuck forever? Timothy's response was gentle. You know what? When I was your age, I got separated from my dad once. I was so scared. But you know what he told me when he found me? Lily shook her head. He said that love is like a rope that connects people. Even when you can't see each other, even when you're far apart, that rope is still there. You can't see it, but you can feel it if you're really quiet and pay attention. Matthew felt his breath catch. Was this a real memory? Had James Walker said those words to young Timothy in the bus or in the woods or during their final desperate journey? Can you feel it? Lily asked, her tears slowing. Close your eyes, Timothy suggested. Think about your mom. Think about how much she loves you. Lily closed her eyes, concentrating with the intensity only a child could muster. After a moment, she smiled. I feel it. Then you're not forgotten. You're just waiting. A car honked, and Lily's mother waved frantically from a minivan. Lily ran off with a quick, Bye, Mr. Carter, leaving Timothy and Matthew standing in the snow. You're good with them, Matthew said. Timothy shrugged. I had a good teacher, my dad. He died when I was young, but he taught me that love and learning could happen anywhere, even in the hardest times. Matthew wanted to say he wanted to tell Timothy about the bus, about the journal, about the movement his story had become. But he held back, remembering his promise to his parents, his decision to let Timothy's past remain undisturbed. I should go, Timothy said. But, Matthew, if you're serious about teaching, come observe my class sometime. It's good to see different styles before you develop your own. I'd like that, Matthew said, and meant it. He did visit Timothy's class several times over the spring semester. He watched Timothy teach mathematics using song, science, using experiments that seemed more like magic tricks reading, using voices and gestures that made stories come alive. He saw how Timothy handled difficult children always with patience, always looking for the fear or hurt behind the behavior. One day Timothy was teaching about families, about how they came in all shapes and sizes. He had the children draw their families, then share if they wanted to. My family is just me and my grandma, one boy said. That's a perfect family, Timothy responded. My family has 2 moms, a girl shared. That's a perfect family too. Then Timothy did something that made Matthew's heart stop. He drew his own family on the board, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. When I was little, he said, my family was just me and my dad. We didn't have a regular house. We lived in different places, sometimes camping, sometimes in shelters, but we were a perfect family because we loved each other. The children were fascinated. Where did you live? One asked. Lots of places. But my favorite was this old bus in the forest. My dad turned it into a little house. We had books and toys and a stove to cook on. It was like a fairy tale. Were you scared? A little girl asked. Timothy considered this. Sometimes, but my dad always made me feel safe. He taught me everything: how to read, how to count, how to tie my shoes, how to be brave when things were hard. Where is he now? Another child asked with the blunt curiosity of youth. He died when I was 7, but I still remember everything he taught me. And now I get to teach all of you. It's like he's still teaching just through me. Matthew had to excuse himself, stepping into the hallway to compose himself. When he returned, Timothy gave him a questioning look, but didn't comment. After class, as Matthew helped clean up, Timothy said, I don't usually share that much about my childhood, but something about today felt right. The kids needed to hear it, Matthew said carefully. Maybe, or maybe I needed to say it. Timothy was quiet for a moment. You know, I've never taken my daughter there. To the bus. Matthew's hand stilled on the papers he was organizing. It still exists. Last I heard, people know about it now somehow. It's become this pilgrimage site, I guess, for people interested in unusual stories of survival and love. Do you mind that people go there? Timothy shook his head. It doesn't belong to me anymore. Maybe it never did. It belonged to the moment, to the necessity. Now it belongs to whoever needs to find it. That weekend, Matthew made his own pilgrimage to the bus. The trail was well worn now, the path clear. When he arrived, he found he wasn't alone. A young couple was there reading the plaque, taking pictures. They nodded at Matthew, but didn't speak, respecting the contemplative atmosphere. The bus itself showed another year of decay. The roof had partially caved in and birds had built nests in the rafters. But someone had been maintaining it too, clearing the worst of the debris, ensuring the plaque remained readable, leaving fresh flowers. Matthew sat on a log nearby and pulled out his journal. He'd started keeping one after finding James Walker's Feeling the Importance of Documenting Life as It Happened. He wrote about Timothy's class, about the story Timothy had shared with his students, about the strange circular nature of their narrative. As he wrote, more visitors arrived: a family with teenage children, an elderly man alone, a group of college students. Some left flowers, others left notes. One person had brought a laminated photograph of their own father and tucked it into the frame of the bus, adding their story to the collection. Matthew realized this was what the bus had become. Not just James and Timothy's story, but a repository for all stories of parental love, sacrifice, survival against odds. It had transformed from a specific tragedy to a universal symbol. When he returned to campus, Matthew found an email from Timothy. Thanks for your help in class these past weeks. You have a natural gift with children. If you'd like, I could recommend you for a student teaching position here next year. We could use someone with your patience and perspective. Matthew stared at the email for a long time before responding. I would be honored. Thank you for everything you've taught me, even when you didn't know you were teaching. Timothy's response came quickly. The best teaching often happens that way. That summer, Matthew got a job at a day camp in Portland, working with children Timothy's age when he'd lived in the bus. He found himself using techniques he'd observed in Timothy's classroom, adapting them to outdoor education. He taught them about nature, about survival skills, about the way families could take many forms. One evening, his parents visited Portland, and they all went to dinner in the Pearl District. Over dessert, Clara brought up something that had been bothering her. Do you think we should tell him, Timothy, about how his story affected us, inspired Matthew? Daniel considered this. What would it accomplish? He's made peace with his past. He's built a beautiful life. Would knowing about our involvement add anything to that? It might let him know his father's sacrifice was witnessed, Clara argued, that it mattered to people beyond just them. Matthew spoke up. I think he knows it mattered. Every child he teaches, every moment of patience he shows, every time he chooses kindness over expedience, that's him knowing it mattered. He doesn't need our validation. He's been validating his father's love every day for 20 years. They walked along the waterfront after dinner, watching the lights reflect on the river. Matthew told them about Timothy's class, about the family drawings, about Timothy sharing his story with his students. He's healing, Clara said wonderingly. After all these years, he's still healing. Aren't we all? Daniel asked. Isn't that what the bus taught us? That healing isn't a destination, but a journey, sometimes through the woods, sometimes through the years. As autumn approached and Matthew prepared for his sophomore year, he learned that Timothy's daughter Sarah would be starting kindergarten at Roosevelt Elementary. Not in Timothy's class, the school had policies about that, but in the classroom next door. Matthew saw them on the first day of school. Timothy was crouched down fixing Sarah's backpack straps, whispering something that made her giggle. She had his eyes that same kind intensity, and when she hugged him goodbye, she held on just a second longer than necessary, as if ensuring the connection was solid before letting go. Watching them, Matthew understood something fundamental about cycles, about how love reproduces itself across generations. James Walker had loved Timothy fiercely, desperately, imperfectly, but absolutely. Timothy had taken that love and refined it, channeled it into his teaching, his fatherhood, his daily choices. And now Sarah would carry it forward, probably never knowing about a bus in the woods where her grandfather had made impossible choices to protect her father. During his student teaching that fall, Matthew was assigned to Timothy's classroom as an assistant. They developed an easy rhythm, Timothy leading while Matthew supported, but sometimes Timothy would step back and let Matthew take over, observing with that careful attention he gave everything. One afternoon, teaching about weather patterns, Matthew found himself telling the students about getting lost in the woods with his family, about how fog could make familiar places strange, how important it was to stay calm and think clearly when you're scared. "Did you find your way out?" a student asked anxiously. "We did, but we also found something unexpected, something that changed our lives." "What was it?" several children asked at once. Matthew glanced at Timothy, who was watching with interest. "We found a story. Someone else's story left behind like a gift. And that story taught us about courage and love and how people can take care of each other even in difficult circumstances." "Can you tell us the story?" a girl asked. "Maybe someday," Matthew said. "When you're older. But the important thing to know now is that stories are everywhere waiting to be found. And sometimes the best stories are the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the people they love." After the students left, Timothy approached Matthew. "That was beautifully handled, the mystery without the details. Children need to know that there are profound things waiting for them in the world without being burdened by adult complexities." "Something my dad taught me," Matthew said. "That kindness is usually the right choice, even when you're not sure what the right choice is." Timothy smiled. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is. He found a story once and knew how to hold it gently, how to let it be what it needed to be without forcing it to be more." Something flickered in Timothy's eyes, a moment of recognition or curiosity, but he didn't pursue it. Instead, he began preparing for the next day's lessons, and Matthew joined him, two teachers connected by a story that one knew completely and the other knew only in fragments. That evening, Matthew called his parents. "I think he knows," he said without preamble. "Knows what?" Daniel asked. "That we're connected somehow, that there's something more than coincidence in my being here. He doesn't know the specifics, but he senses something." "Is that bad?" Clara asked. "No," Matthew said after a pause. "It's like he said about love being a rope between people. You can't always see it, but you can feel it if you pay attention. He's paying attention, and he's choosing not to pull on the rope, to let it be what it is without demanding explanation." Winter came early again that year, and with it, a decision. The local historical society had contacted the Reed family through the memorial fund they'd contributed to. They were creating a permanent exhibit about unconventional homes and families in Oregon history, and wanted to include the bus. They had materials from various sources, but had heard the Reeds had actually discovered the site. The family debated it over a long video call. Would participating expose them? Would it somehow lead back to Timothy? Would it violate the unspoken agreement they'd all made to protect the story while allowing it to exist? Finally, Matthew suggested they contribute anonymously, but specifically. They could provide photographs, share the journal entries they'd copied, even record audio descriptions of finding the bus. But everything would be attributed to the Discovery family, keeping their identities protected. They agreed, and over the next months worked with the Historical Society to create something respectful but real. The exhibit, when it opened, featured a recreation of part of the bus interior, complete with the makeshift furniture and children's drawings. James Walker's journal entries were displayed, in part his handwriting enlarged, and mounted his words about Timothy's fever particularly prominent. The opening was on a Thursday evening in March. The Reeds attended standing anonymously in the crowd as people moved through the exhibit. The response was overwhelming. Tears whispered conversations, parents pulling their children closer. And then Matthew saw him, Timothy Carter, standing in front of the journal, display his hand pressed to his mouth, his eyes wide. Sarah was with him, holding his other hand, asking questions he wasn't answering. Matthew moved closer, unable to stop himself. "Daddy, why are you crying?" Sarah asked. Timothy knelt down, pulling her close. "These are happy tears, sweetheart. This is about someone I knew a long time ago, someone very brave." "Your daddy?" Sarah asked, because Timothy had told her some stories, carefully edited versions of life in the woods. "Yes, my daddy, your grandfather. The one who taught you everything." "Everything important," Timothy confirmed. He stood lifting Sarah to his hip, and that's when he saw Matthew. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and in that moment Matthew knew that Timothy knew. Not the details, not the full story, but the essence of it that Matthew was connected to, this that his presence in Timothy's life wasn't random. Timothy didn't approach him. Instead, he nodded a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but clear in its meaning. "Thank you for finding it, for preserving it, for being here, for understanding." Matthew nodded back. "You're welcome. Thank you for surviving, for becoming who you are, for teaching." Then Timothy turned, carrying Sarah to another part of the exhibit, and Matthew let them go. Some conversations didn't need words, some connections were stronger for remaining unspoken. The exhibit changed everything and nothing. Timothy continued teaching, Matthew continued his student teaching, and they worked together 3 days a week, as if that moment of recognition at the Historical Society had never happened. But there was a different quality to their interactions now, a deeper understanding that lived beneath their professional exchanges about lesson plans and classroom management. Spring arrived with unusual warmth that year, and Timothy suggested taking his class on a nature walk to study plant growth and seasonal changes. Matthew helped organize permission slips and emergency contact forms, but his mind was elsewhere. The walk would take them within a mile of the bus. He wondered if Timothy knew this, if perhaps this was intentional. The morning of the walk, 22 first graders lined up outside Roosevelt Elementary, wearing their bright yellow safety vests and carrying notebooks for their observations. Timothy led from the front while Matthew brought up the rear, making sure no one strayed from the group. "Mr. Carter." A boy named Jackson asked, "Why do trees grow up instead of sideways?" Timothy stopped, crouching down to Jackson's level. "What do you think? Look at that tree over there. What's it reaching for? The sun." "Exactly. Trees are always reaching for light. Even when they're growing in difficult places, even when it would be easier to stop growing, they keep reaching up. It's called phototropism." "Photo what?" several children asked in unison. "It means growing toward light," Timothy explained. "People do it too in a way. We grow toward what nurtures us." They continued walking, stopping frequently for Timothy to point out moss patterns, bird nests, the way roots created natural steps in the hillside. Matthew watched him teach with the same patience his father must have shown in that bus, turning every question into a lesson, every observation into a discovery. When they reached a small clearing, Timothy called for a snack break, as the children sat in circles sharing goldfish crackers and juice boxes. Timothy walked over to Matthew. "There's something I want to show you," he said quietly. "Can you watch them for a moment?" Before Matthew could respond, Timothy walked to the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the trees. He returned less than a minute later, carrying something, a piece of rusted metal, twisted and weathered. "Part of an old vehicle," he told the curious children who gathered around. "Been in these woods for decades. Nature is slowly taking it back, recycling it into something new." "What kind of vehicle was?" a girl asked. "Hard to say now," Timothy replied, but his eyes met Matthew's. "Could have been anything. The important thing is that even things that seem permanent, like metal and machines, eventually return to the earth. Nothing lasts forever except what Mr. Carter, Jackson prompted. Except the changes we make in other people's lives. Those ripple outward forever. They returned to school after lunch, the children chattering about their adventure, their notebooks full of sketches and observations. Matthew helped Timothy organize their findings into a bulletin board display, neither of them mentioning the piece of metal that Timothy had quietly placed in his desk drawer. That afternoon, after the students had gone home, Timothy pulled out the metal fragment. "I go there sometimes," he said simply. "Not often. Maybe once a year, just to remember." "Remember what, Shalom?" Matthew asked, though he knew. "That love can exist anywhere. That education doesn't require a classroom. That my father was the bravest man I've ever known, even if the world never knew his name." Matthew chose his words carefully. The world knows now. The exhibit, the memorial at the site. People know what happened there mattered. Timothy turned the metal piece over in his hands. "My daughter asked me last week if her grandfather was famous, after seeing the exhibit. I told her no, he wasn't famous. But he was important. There's a difference." "What did she say?" "She said she wanted to be important like him. Not famous, but important to someone." Timothy's voice caught slightly. "She's 5 years old, and she already understands what most adults never learn." That weekend, Matthew's parents came to Portland for a visit. They met at a restaurant downtown, and Matthew told them about the nature walk, about Timothy taking that piece of metal, about the conversation after. "He's making peace with it," Clara said. "Finally, after all these years." "Or maybe," Daniel suggested, "he made peace with it long ago, and we're just now seeing what that peace looks like. It's not about forgetting or moving on. It's about carrying it forward transformed." They walked through the city after dinner, ending up at the waterfront, where street musicians played and children chased bubbles blown by a performer in elaborate costume. Watching the families, Matthew thought about cycles, about how Timothy's daughter Sarah would grow up taking safety and love for granted in ways Timothy never could. "I've been thinking about Marcus Reed," Clara said suddenly. "The ranger who helped them. He must be in his late 70s now." "Early 80s, Daniel corrected. "Why?" "I want to thank him, properly, for what he did." They found Reed still living in the same house with the garden gnomes, though he moved more slowly now, aided by a walker. He recognized them immediately and invited them in for coffee that was too strong and cookies that were too stale. "I heard about the exhibit," he said without preamble. "Even went to see it. Strange to see something you kept secret for 30 years displayed on a wall." "Do you regret helping them?" Matthew asked. Reed's laugh was rusty but genuine. "Son, I spent 30 years as a ranger. Rescued lost hikers, fought fires, dealt with everything from bear attacks to drug operations. But helping that man and his boy, that's the thing I'm proudest of. The one time I chose humanity over regulations." "Did you ever wonder what happened to them?" Clara asked. "Every damn day for years. Then I heard rumors a boy in foster care who might have been him, a teacher in Portland who told stories that sounded familiar. But I never pursued it. Some things are better left to hope than confirmed by fact." "He's doing well," Matthew said carefully. "The boy. He became a teacher, has a daughter of his own." Reed's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. A teacher. James would have been so proud. He was always teaching that boy, even when they had nothing but the woods and that broken-down bus. "Mr. Reed," Daniel said. "Would you like to meet him, Timothy?" "Not to reveal anything, just to see him." Reed shook his head firmly. "That's not my story to enter. I played my part 30 years ago. But knowing he's okay, knowing he made it, that's enough. That's more than enough." They left Reed with promises to visit again, though they all knew they probably wouldn't. Some connections were meant to be brief, powerful, and complete in themselves. As spring turned toward summer, Matthew's student teaching period was coming to an end. He'd been offered a position at Roosevelt starting in the fall, not in Timothy's grade, but teaching 3rd grade. He'd accepted immediately, knowing he was choosing more than just a job. On his last day as Timothy's student teacher, the class threw a small party. The children had made cards, their messages ranging from "you're nice" to "thank you for helping me with math when I was sad." Timothy had contributed to a card that simply said, "For teaching me about teaching while I thought I was teaching you about teaching." After the children left, Matthew and Timothy cleaned the classroom together one last time. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations. "Can I tell you something?" Timothy asked suddenly. "About the bus?" Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice. "The last night we spent there, my father held me and told me stories until I fell asleep. Stories about brave knights and clever princesses and dragons who were actually kind. But the last story he told was about a boy who would grow up to be a teacher who would help other children learn and grow and be brave. He said that boy was me, that it was my future he was seeing." Timothy paused, organizing already organized supplies. "I thought it was just a fairy tale, something to make me feel better. But sitting here now in this classroom, where I've taught for 20 years, where you've been learning to teach, I think maybe he really could see it. Maybe love lets you see futures that seem impossible." "He'd be proud," Matthew said softly. "I hope so. I hope he knows wherever he is that his son became what he prophesied that night." There was a long silence, comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Timothy spoke again. "You know, don't you? About more than just what's in the exhibit. You have a connection to this story that's deeper than coincidence." Matthew considered his response carefully. "My family found something once, something that changed us, made us think about love differently, about what people will do to protect each other. It inspired me to become a teacher." Timothy nodded slowly. "The Discovery Family, from the exhibit attribution." "Yes." "Thank you," Timothy said simply, "for finding it, for preserving it, for caring about strangers you'd never met." "We weren't strangers," Matthew said. "Not after we found the bus. We became part of the story whether we meant to or not." Timothy smiled a sad but genuine expression. Stories are like that. They reach out and grab people, make them part of something larger than themselves. That evening, Matthew met his parents for dinner at their hotel. He told them about the conversation, about Timothy's acknowledgement of their connection. "So he knows," Clara said. "He knows enough," Matthew replied. "And he's choosing to let it be what it is, a story that connects us without requiring full disclosure or confrontation." "That's very mature of him," Daniel observed. "He's had 30-some years to practice managing complicated truths," Matthew pointed out. They ate in contemplative silence for a while, each processing this new development. Finally, Clara spoke. "I want to do something, not for Timothy directly, but for the story, for James." She explained her idea. She wanted to establish a scholarship fund at Portland State's education program specifically for students who'd experienced homelessness or housing insecurity. It would be called the Walker Fund, and it would help future teachers who understood what it meant to learn in difficult circumstances. "It's perfect," Matthew said immediately. "It honors both of them without intruding on Timothy's life." They established the fund that summer with an initial endowment that would support one student per year. The application required an essay about a teacher who'd made a difference in the applicant's life, especially in unconventional circumstances. The first recipient was announced that fall, a young woman named Maria, who'd lived in her car during high school while her mother worked 3 jobs. Her essay was about a librarian who'd let her stay after hours to study, who'd taught her that education was a door that once opened could never be closed. Matthew started his 3rd grade teaching position that September. His classroom was 2 doors down from Timothy's, and they fell into an easy collegial rhythm, sharing supplies, combining classes for special projects, consulting on difficult students. One afternoon in October, Timothy knocked on Matthew's door during his prep period. "I have a proposition," he said. "Sarah's been asking about camping. She wants to see where I lived when I was little. I've been putting it off, but I think maybe it's time. Would you and your parents like to come with us as the Discovery Family? You could share your perspective, and I could share mine." Matthew's heart raced. "Are you sure that's a big step?" "I've been holding this story so tight for so long," Timothy said. "Maybe it's time to let it breathe. And I can't think of better people to share it with than the ones who found it and honored it." The trip was planned for a Saturday in early November when the weather was still mild enough for hiking, but the summer crowds had dispersed. Matthew's parents drove up from home bringing the original photographs they'd taken and copies of the journal pages they'd preserved. They met at the trailhead early in the morning. Sarah was vibrating with excitement, wearing a tiny hiking backpack and carrying a walking stick she'd decorated with ribbons. Timothy looked nervous, but determined like someone about to jump off a high dive. "Thank you for coming," he said to Daniel and Clara, shaking their hands formally. "Matthews told me a little about how you found the place. I'm grateful you were the ones." The hike took on an almost ceremonial quality. Sarah ran ahead, then back reporting on every interesting rock and stick. The adults walked in comfortable conversation, carefully avoiding the heavier aspects of the story until they were ready. When they finally reached the bus, Sarah stopped in her tracks. "Daddy, is that it? Is that really where you lived?" "That's it, sweetheart. It looked different then, less broken, more like a real home. But yes, that's where Grandpa James and I lived." She approached it slowly, almost reverently. The bus was more deteriorated than ever, truly becoming part of the forest now. But the plaque remained, and fresh flowers lay at its base. Other pilgrims had been here recently. "Can we go inside?" Sarah asked. "Carefully," Timothy said, "and only if Matthew's dad says it's safe." Daniel checked the structure, declared the front section stable enough for a careful visit. Sarah climbed the steps her father had climbed as a child, her small feet navigating the same rusted metal. Inside, Timothy began to tell her the story, the real story, or at least a version of it suitable for a 5-year-old. He showed her where his bed had been, where the kitchen was set up, where his father had taught him to read and write and count. "Were you scared?" Sarah asked the same question his students had asked. "Sometimes, but Grandpa James always made me feel safe. He told me we were having an adventure, that we were explorers in our own secret kingdom." "Why couldn't you live in a regular house?" Timothy glanced at the other adults, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes the world gets complicated for grown-ups. Grandpa James had to make hard choices to keep me safe. This was the best choice he could make at the time." Sarah seemed to accept this, moving on to examine the remnants of the drawings still visible on the walls. "Did you draw these?" "I did. I was just a little older than you are now." "They're good," Sarah declared with the generous assessment of a fellow young artist. While Timothy showed Sarah around, Clara pulled Matthew aside. "Look at them," she said softly. 3 generations connected by this place. James would be so proud." They spent several hours at the site. Daniel and Timothy worked together to clear some of the overgrowth, making it safer for future visitors. Clara and Sarah collected interesting leaves and rocks, with Clara teaching her the names of different plants. Matthew documented it all with his camera, understanding he was witnessing something profound, a circle closing a story, completing itself while simultaneously beginning anew. As they prepared to leave, Timothy pulled something from his backpack, a new metal box like the one Matthew had left months before. "I want to leave something," he said, "for whoever comes next." Inside the box was a photo of 3 generations James Walker, from the one clear photograph that existed Timothy at Sarah's current age and now in Sarah herself. There was also a letter which Timothy read aloud. "To whoever finds this. This place was my home from age 6 to 7. My father, James Walker, brought me here not to hide, but to survive. He taught me everything in this small space: how to read, write, think, question, dream. Most importantly, he taught me that love doesn't require perfect circumstances. I survived because of his sacrifice. I thrived because strangers chose kindness. A ranger who looked the other way and helped when he could. Families who found this place and preserved its story. Foster parents who gave me a new chance. Teachers who saw potential where others might have seen damage. I became a teacher myself, trying every day to be for my students what my father was for me, patient, kind, believing in their possibility, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. My daughter Sarah now knows this story. She'll carry it forward in her own way, probably differently than I have, certainly differently than my father could have imagined. If you're reading this, you're part of the story now too. What you do with that is up to you. But know that this place, broken and returning to earth as it is, stands as proof that love finds a way. Always." Timothy Carter, born Timothy Walker, November 2024. He sealed the box and placed it in a protected spot near the plaque. Sarah added her own contribution, a painted rock with a heart on it, which she wedged carefully next to the box. The hike back was quieter, everyone processing what they'd experienced. Sarah walked between Timothy and Matthew, holding both their hands, creating a living chain that connected past and future. At the cars, as they prepared to part ways, Sarah tugged on Clara's sleeve. Mrs. Reed, thank you for finding my daddy's old home. He's been sad about it for a long time, but I think he's happy now. Clara knelt down, tears in her eyes. You're welcome, sweetheart. Your daddy is a very special person. I know, Sarah said matter-of-factly. He teaches kids. That's the most important job. Timothy invited them all for dinner at his house, and they accepted. His wife Rebecca had prepared a feast somehow, understanding the magnitude of the day without needing all the details. She was a pediatric nurse, someone who understood trauma and healing, who'd helped Timothy navigate his complicated past without demanding he excavate it before he was ready. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily. Sarah showed off her room, her drawings, her collection of rocks from various adventures. She was particularly proud of a height chart on her doorframe, not unlike the one that had been scratched into the bus wall decades before. We mark it every month, she explained to Matthew. Daddy says growing happens so slowly you can't see it, but if you mark it, you have proof it happened. Later, while Sarah played and Rebecca cleaned up, despite everyone's offers to help, the 5 adults sat in the living room sharing stories more freely now that the biggest secret was open. Timothy told them things he'd never told anyone about the games his father invented to make their isolation bearable, about the songs they'd sung to stay warm, about the moment he'd realized his father was getting weaker and his child's determination to save him somehow. I told him I didn't need much food, Timothy remembered. I said I wasn't hungry. I was trying to make sure he ate enough, but he knew what I was doing. He said, Timothy, taking care of each other means letting people take care of you too. I never forgot that. Daniel shared about finding the journal, about the weight of reading James's words, about the responsibility they'd felt to honor the story without exploiting it. You did exactly right, Timothy assured them. You let it be what it needed to be. As the evening wound down, Timothy walked them to their cars. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. This won't be the last time, he said. Sarah will want to go back probably many times as she grows up. Would you consider being part of those visits? As her honorary grandparents, maybe. She doesn't have any living grandparents, and you're the closest thing to family. This story has given us. Clara was crying too hard to speak, but she nodded vigorously. Daniel cleared his throat several times before managing, "We'd be honored." Matthew and Timothy stood together for a moment after his parents drove away. You know what the strangest part is, Timothy said. I spent so many years afraid of this story, afraid of people finding out, afraid of judgment or pity or I don't know what. But you and your family, you showed me it could be held differently. With respect and love instead of shame. That's a gift I can never repay. You repay it every day, Matthew said. Every child you teach, every moment of patience you show, every time you choose kindness when the world has given you every reason to be bitter. That's the repayment. They shook hands, then impulsively hugged 2 teachers. 2 men connected by a story neither of them had asked for, but both had chosen to honor. The years that followed brought regular pilgrimages to the bus. Sarah grew taller, her marks on the doorframe climbing steadily, her understanding of the story deepening with each visit. She began bringing friends, sometimes sharing the story with a child's matter-of-fact acceptance. This is where my grandpa lived with my dad when they didn't have anywhere else to go. He was really brave. The bus itself continued its slow dissolution, becoming more forest than vehicle with each passing season. But the memorial grew not physically, but in meaning. The scholarship fund expanded, supporting more students each year. The exhibit at the Historical Society became permanent, visited by thousands who left, moved by the story of a father's love. Matthew continued teaching, eventually becoming principal of Roosevelt Elementary. He hired teachers who understood that education was about more than test scores, who knew that sometimes the most important lessons happened outside traditional structures. Timothy became the district's mentor for new teachers, sharing his philosophy that every child deserved someone who believed in their possibility. And somewhere in whatever space exists beyond physical life, perhaps James Walker knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. His son had not just survived, but thrived. The love he'd poured into that broken-down bus in the woods had multiplied, spreading through classrooms and generations, touching lives he could never have imagined. The bus itself would eventually collapse completely, returning fully to the earth. But what happened there, the love, the lessons, the proof that humans can create sanctuary in the most unlikely places that would endure as long as there were people to tell the story, teachers to pass on the lessons, and families to choose love over fear.